Hey, it's Red May all the way to the end of May, and a specter is haunting Red May today. Yes, the specter of communism, but we have a special specter. We have, in fact, 6 editors of the new magazine, Spectre. We will get into that in a moment, but first, we have only 4 events left, so I want to clue you in as to what's coming up. Tomorrow at 12 p.m., we have Border Panic and Contagion. With Dan Denver, Harsha Walia, Jasker and Dillon as the moderator, Malav Kanuga, Megan Ibarra, and Charu Charushila. And then we have an event on Friday at on June 5th. That is at 1 p.m. Dan Denver of Jacobins The Dig is going to interview Holly Jean Buck, who's the author of a new book from Verso, After Geoengineering. We are also going to do the panel COVID-19 and the carceral state, which we canceled earlier today because everyone on it are going to the protests in their various cities as protesting the murder of George Floyd, as are many of the people in Red May in Seattle. We've had reports so far. They've taken out a Ferrari window, a Mercedes window, and the window Amazon Go. And there's also been a 5 o'clock curfew declared. So we'll keep you posted if anything interesting comes in. I do want to say something about Spectre magazine, particularly. I'm a subscriber, and I want to say I know everybody's feeling a great sense of a void as commune has disappeared, and maybe you're looking for where to put your money in a new subscription. And for somebody who has been to Red May, this is excellent. There was an article by Chinzi Arutza, who you saw last year at Red May. She's reviewing Susan Ferguson's new book on women and work. You went to the Red May panel last year on Chile 1973, America 2020 about Salvador Allende and Bernie Sanders, and Marianne Schlatterbuck was on it, talking about her new book, Beyond the Vanguard. That's reviewed here by Jeffrey Weber. Susan Ferguson reviews writes on Sophie Lewis, who you've seen about 3 times this month. So it'll be all really familiar. Plus there's a great article on white privilege by Vanessa Wills, which is definitely something that one should be reading this day at this current moment. And of course, David McNally's Return to the Mass Strike, which as we see is, we can talk about whether that's intersecting Joshua Clover's riot or not. He does talk about in the article. So plenty to read, and I urge everybody to subscribe to it. Now, however, I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's event, David McNally, who's a professor of history at the University of Houston. Many of you know him as the author of Monsters of the Market, or Political Economy and the Rise of Capitalism Against the Market, the Global Slump. Lots of great stuff. David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thanks for all the efforts of everyone involved with Red May, both for the events you're doing and, of course, for inviting us from Spectre. We're going to do something interesting around the theme of ghosts of Marxism, which is to say we're going to each editor who's able to make it, and we send apologies from Tithi Bhattacharya and Chinzia Arutza that they couldn't join in tonight. But those of us who are here are going to choose 1 or 2 quotes from sort of classical Marxist texts and writings that we think speak powerfully to our political and social moment in various ways. And then we'll riff a little bit on those quotes. We'll talk about why we've chosen them, what we think the relevance is, how they speak to the crises and struggles that are unfolding around us. I'm going to let each editor introduce themselves, just give us a 1 or 2 sentence bio about who you are and where you are. And I'm going to call on Holly Lewis to get us started.
Unmuting. Sorry about that, had to unmute. So I am Holly Lewis. I'm the author of The Politics of Everybody, and I am based out of Austin, Texas. You want me to say more?
I do. I want you now to tell us about your quotes and.
Oh, you want we're going on.
I want you to get right into it for us.
Okay, great. Let's go right into it then. So
let's do
okay, so I have two quotes here, and the first one is I don't know. It seems kind of traditional. I went and I looked for the concept of crisis, and I looked through Marx's work, and I'm sticking with Marx myself. But the first quote that I'm choosing is, from the first chapter of the 18th Brumaire, and it goes a little like this. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language. So that's the crisis quote that I'm beginning with. And so, I'm beginning with this because as a queer person, I think a lot about the first part of the quote about how tradition weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, and how heteronorms and cisgender norms are structured by capital, and I think a lot about how they weigh on queer and trans people and on all women. And I think that it's an apt quote for right now, because right now we're seeing how the tradition of white supremacy is a literal knee weighing on the necks of Black people in America. But this quote isn't just about the traditions that are imposed on us from the bourgeois order. What I think is interesting is that it's also about how we fall back on our own traditions, even radical traditions, in a time of crisis. And this part of the statement, and just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, do we anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past in their service. And so this is, in some sense, critical of the instinct to revert towards our past traditional ways, even as communists and socialists. So I thought about, what does that mean as a co-editor of a journal that's called Spectre, right? What does it mean to haunt? And how does haunting relate to living structure? To living struggle? And how is haunting different than tradition? And I think that the answer to this question in part lies in the meaning of the word crisis. And a crisis is a juncture where the usual way, the instituted way, the traditional way is a problem, and there is, as of yet, no new solution, right? So in that moment of political rupture, we're clinging to the old way because we haven't found a novel way to transform our tradition, our condition. To cling to the past in that moment is at best to embrace inertia, and that leads to farce or tragedy. So the specter of communism, if you will, isn't the specter of some glorious past, but is our possible collective future. And it's the new thing that's yet to be born, the new thing that we yet do not know how to create. So none of this means, of course, that the past itself is meaningless or that we shouldn't look to the past or study it, because it's important to know the past in order to learn patterns, cause and effect, understand what works under what conditions. And the past can inspire us. It can fuel the hope that leads to something new. So I started thinking about what's the problem here. And the problem, as I think about it, is this idea of tradition, ceremony, habit. using the same old approach, the same old tactics, the same old strategies, because that's just how we do things, or it's in our tradition. And when we do that, this concept of we're employing this concept of tradition, we're ignoring concrete conditions on the ground a lot of times. What we're missing is what's different or distinct or new in a particular crisis. And one of the things I like about being an editor at Spectre is that we're not looking to replace some tradition or way of looking at things. We're not looking to come in and reassert some tradition or way of looking at things, but we're wondering together collaboratively how we can look at the crises of our time with fresh eyes. Do you want me to go into the second? Should I go into the second quote that I have? Yeah?
I think you should.
Okay. So the next one is a as much as my first one was a traditional, if you will, quote, the next one is a bit of a weird choice. And it's a letter from Marx to his friend Louis Kugelman from 1866. And the quote here is, "In consequence of my long illness, my economic situation has reached a point of crisis. I've accumulated debts, which are a crushing mental burden and make me incapable of any other activity other than the work in which I am immersed." And so why did I choose this quote? So I chose this quote because this is something that we don't often talk about a lot, and that's that social and economic crises lead to personal crises. And in the United States, we live in this horribly individualistic culture where every personal burden is somehow put forth as if it's a kind of a personal failure. Every illness, the mental burdens that crush us, catching COVID, every problem stems from the soul of an insufficiently rugged individual, but the illness and alienation and anxiety and the crushing burdens of survival under capitalism are individual experiences of a collective problem. And I just think that that's worth noting. And I think that scaling down the macro to the micro in this case is actually apt. And in many ways, what we're dealing with right now with the COVID crisis is that the old ways of survival in this moment aren't really working for us. Everything from kind of the repetitive traditional marches and demonstrations that are, peaceful and calm, whatever, or voting, for example. People are realizing that none of that works. Right? Whether we could delude ourselves into the past as thinking that that was working, none of these things are solving our problems anymore. And we don't know how to break into that new way of being. So this is not only putting us in a collective situation, but we're all feeling this individually. And I think that this is coming out in our movements in interesting ways, and that one of the things that we can do as the revolutionary left is to not repeat these kind of rugged individualist sentiments in our own organizing, and understand that that we needed to find a way to collectively handle these crises that become very personal and very embodied, even though they're imposed on us by capital. So those are my two quotes, and hopefully that starts everybody off in a way that can move forward.
That's great. Thank you, Holly.
Thanks, Holly.
You've gotten us started. The ball is now rolling, and I'm going to pass things over to Zachary Levenson.
Sure. Thanks, David. Well, my name's Zach Levenson. I'm based in Greensboro, North Carolina, and of course, I'm one of the editors of Spectre. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank Bill and everybody else for making this event happen. So, like Holly, I'm going to talk about two quotes. And what I want to do is try to tie them together. So first, I want to talk about my favorite quote from Rosa Luxemburg's The Math Strike, in which she's talking about what she's going to call abstract logical analysis. So she says that going around calling for revolution in some kind of abstract way, instead of connecting to people's real lived experiences, is worthless. So she writes, quote, "It signifies nothing but an external form of the class struggle, which can have sense and meaning only in connection with definite political situations. So she's saying here, definite political situations, people's real lived experiences. To continue, she says, if anyone were to undertake to make the mass strike generally as a form of proletarian action, the object of methodical agitation, and to go house to house canvassing with this idea in order to gradually win the working class to it, it would be as idle and profitless and absurd an occupation as it would be to seek to make the idea of the revolution or of the fight at the barricades the object of a special agitation. So there's a lot going on there. So what's she talking about? Well, above all, she's talking about this notion of going house to house canvassing with the idea of the mass strike, or we might say the idea of socialism. She's saying it doesn't really work. So to put her same point slightly differently, if as communists we seek to build some kind of large anti-capitalist movement, we don't need to approach people and ask them how they feel about capitalism in general. We want to know how it connects to their definite political situations. So what I've called here a politics of everyday life. So how do working class people concretely experience capitalism in their lives? So one of my favorite uses of this quote is actually in the first chapter of Piven and Cloward's book, Poor People's Movements. And they use this quote from Luxemburg to illustrate how key feature of the most oppressed elements of society. This key feature, they argue, is because the poor tend to lack stable organizational resources, because they're really just focused on surviving day to day. The circumstances that lead to mass defiance by the lower class are extremely difficult to predict, they say. And once defiance erupts, its direction is difficult for leaders to control. Yet these spontaneous uprisings are of enormous consequence and tend to reverberate throughout society. Socialism isn't really about to appear before us in some ready-to-hand form. And this is why I'm so skeptical of what I like to call a politics of trickle-down universalism. So if we want to be effective as communists, our task is to demonstrate to people why socialism applies to their lives, but as they actually live them. You know, sure, sometimes people get to experience the cartoon version of capitalism, and then our task is easy. But that's rarely, of course, the case. In the real world, people experience capitalism in unexpected ways. So for example, if we're trying to mobilize a precariously employed sector of the workforce, and many of them are undocumented, surely this needs to figure into our analysis. Or, you know, apropos to the current moment, if we were to think about policing, which is indisputably tied to the repressive function of the capitalist state. So how do people experience policing? I want to read a second quote. This one's from Stuart Hall, that I think especially gets at this question, and I think it works really well with Luxemburg's lines. It comes from his book, Policing the Crisis, which is unfortunately not a very widely read book these days, but I think it absolutely should be. So Hall writes, just as the structures which reproduce the Black worker, male and female, as a sub-proletariat work through race, so the forms of resistance and struggle which have begun to reveal themselves in response also, naturally and correctly, tend to crystallize in relation to race. It is through the operation of racism that Blacks are beginning to comprehend how the system works. It is through a specific kind of Black consciousness that they're beginning to appropriate or to come to consciousness of their class position, organize against it, and fight it out. So look at what he's doing here. Capitalism, he's arguing, works through race. So what does he mean by this? So if we think about large sections of the working class and the reserve army, who are kept in perpetual poverty, excluded from valuable real estate, and whose violent containment is legitimized through both de jure and de facto racism. So even if they're absolutely an oppressed section of the proletariat, they tend not to primarily experience capitalism at the point of production. They may hate their jobs, but often this form of alienation doesn't take on a collective guise. Some of this might be due to repressive labor legislation, we could say, or low union density, but the fact is, this isn't the primary site of resistance in the current moment. That site of resistance should be obvious to everyone listening in tonight. It's not as if the rapidity of the current unemployment rate has inspired mass resistance in the streets. We have, of course, seen dozens of wildcats around the country since March, largely around demands for PPEs and safety on the job. But compare this with what we've seen over the past few days. Here we see tens of thousands of people, probably many more than that, demanding better lives, demanding an immediate end to racist police repression, going so far as to torch police vehicles around the country, even burning down a precinct building in Minneapolis. It's been many decades since we've seen this kind of frontal assault sparked by exploitation in the workplace in the US. So what Hall's saying here is that for many people, above all Black people, capitalism isn't felt, it isn't lived in the workplace so much as in relation to the repressive apparatus. Black people realize far more quickly than their white counterparts that the police aren't here to ensure safety, that the system is rigged, and above all, that there is, in fact, a system. So this vision of the system might not fit the abstract conception that some Marxists often have of a race-blind capitalism, but that's not a problem. And in fact, I'd argue it's a good thing. So insofar as people are coming to consciousness, they'll develop their thoughts in relation to experiences on the ground and the generalization of these experiences across the country. It should be no surprise, then, that Black Americans and other oppressed groups are overwhelmingly in the vanguard of both workers' struggles and struggles against state repression. Not only should we applaud the uprisings, but we should do everything in our power to support them. What is not supportive is complaining that these uprisings aren't assuming the form we'd like to see. Really? Because last I checked, people from the most oppressed sectors of the working class are rising up right now across the country. In Minneapolis, they looted a Target and redistributed useful goods to protesters in a spectacularly organized fashion. I've read reports of something similar happening with items taken from a police precinct there. Sure, this isn't the death knell of capitalism or anything even close, but it's bringing large masses of militants into the street who are unafraid to stand up to the repressive apparatus. As Hall tells us, yes, it's taking the form of anti-racist struggle, but this shouldn't be surprising. Black workers experience capitalism as racist, so why wouldn't this be the case? And think about how these struggles are starting to catalyze labor actions in support, with bus drivers in both Minneapolis and New York refusing to transport cops. So let's hope this tactic spreads as rapidly as the riots and to other sectors as well. If we think back to Luxemburg, we can't go door to door and just appeal to workers to come out and fight against capitalism if they don't know what we mean by the concept. But insofar as we appeal to their everyday experiences, the current wave of struggles corroborates Luxemburg's and Hall's arguments. It also shows that my formulation is a bit off. We don't always have to appeal to the working class, whose militancy is more often catalyzed by self-activity. This isn't to say that there isn't a role for Marxists to play in the uprising, or that we should all get our popcorn and sit idly by. But it is to be clear about one point. The current wave of riots are precisely what we need right now, and they're adopting an ideal form, confronting both large businesses and above all racist police, which is to say, all police. Sure, riots might not get us where we ultimately need to be, but surely they point us in the right direction in a way that electoralism alone never could. If a few days of localized rioting gets a killer cop charged with murder, what could weeks of national rioting achieve? So this is what Marx meant by communism being the real movement of the working class, rather than some idea considered an abstraction. We need to work with the class we have, and if the current struggles are any indication, we're in good hands. So finally, for those who see Hall's analysis as antithetical to Marxism, I want to emphasize his language. So let me reread one sentence from the quote I read from Hall. He ends this way: "It is through a specific kind of Black consciousness that they're beginning to appropriate or come to consciousness of their class position, organize against it, and fight it out." So think about his choice of words here. It's no coincidence. He's of course echoing Marx's famous 1859 preface. Marx wrote about how actually existing struggles are typically spontaneous and unpredictable, and this is because people only become conscious of class through various ideological articulations. It's on this terrain that people tend to, quote, fight it out. It's for this reason that now more than ever, we need a Marxism that does two things. So first, we need a Marxism that treats the self-activity of the working class, which is usually spontaneous, as a good thing, not as an obstacle, but as an actual good thing. And second, we need a Marxism that's capable of thinking about the working class that we actually have, instead of the one we'd like to see. It means that any Marxist analysis that can't account for race, or really any other mode of particularity, isn't worth its salt. And with that, I'll pass it off.
Thank you, Zach. Now I'm going to call on Kate Doyle Griffiths, and Vanessa Wills, you're on deck. Kate.
Hi, so I'm Kate Doyle Griffiths. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York. I'm an editor of Spectre, obviously. I'm also a member of Red Bloom Communist Collective, and I'm a medical anthropologist, and I apparently still work at Brooklyn College, so I didn't get fired amid all the mass firings of my colleagues that have been taking place in the last few weeks. So with that, I want to start my quotes. I tried to pick a couple that I think can speak to the slogan Black Lives Matter, which I think I picked that because, just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, there was a lot of kind of post-mortems on the Black Lives Matter movement as if it was over. And I think right now we're in a moment where I'm realizing that slogan never went away, that's one of the slogans of this mass uprising. And if this mass uprising continues in the direction it is, a lot of what has previously gone under the name Black Lives Matter will be part of the foreword or a footnote in the history of this movement. And so I was thinking about what kind of quotes we could use to understand that slogan as a way of trying to understand this movement and its development. So the first Marxist I thought of looking to was Walter Rodney, actually. And I want to thank my friend Robert Cuffey for being always the inveterate historian and archivist of Rodney's lesser known speeches and works and material, who always talks to me about Walter Rodney, which is partly why I was aware of these quotes. So the one that I picked is one that is from the Sky is Wild documentary, which was made in 1982 or 3, I think, but a couple of years after Rodney was assassinated. Rodney, of course, being a historian and organizer from Guyana, and who sort of just before his assassination became a really sort of vocal and incisive critic of a lot of the kind of liberation governments that came to power in that late 70s, early 80s period. He was assassinated just after coming back from Zimbabwe. But the quote is, "The principal task of our generation is to break the division of the ranks of the working class, to create a unity based on struggle, not on hypothetical unity or a theoretical unity, but a unity based on struggle." And I think this obviously reflects a lot of what Zach was talking about. And of course, that's for his generation, right? Which is not exactly the same generation that's out in the streets today. And I think that is worth thinking about through some of what Holly was talking about. And then a second quick quote from him. I tried to make this one as short as possible. "But out of the history of exploitation in society, it became necessary and seems most reasonable for the population to refer to Europeans as one race, the Portuguese as another, because their perception of race was inextricably bound with the perception of how people made their living. This, to my mind, is a very useful insight into the way in which racism was essentially a factor developing out of a particular mode of production, not out of any aberration in people's minds about color." And he's talking specifically about his own national situation, but I think it's one that is widely applicable to the way that race functions in the world. And then my second quote, and I want to get those all out once and then talk about how I think they're related, is from Marx, but not from any of the great texts of Marx. It's from Marx writing about the Civil War in the US, and particularly commenting on Abraham Lincoln, right, who is known now, as Marx predicted, to be some great liberator and the father of Black liberation and so forth. But what he actually says there, as he's predicting this, what he says is, and that's in 1862, he writes this, "Nothing is simpler than to show that Lincoln's principal political actions contain much that is aesthetically repulsive, logically inadequate, farcical in form, and politically. Lincoln is a sui generis figure in the annals of history. He has no initiative, no idealistic impulse, no historical trappings. He gives his most important actions always the most commonplace form. His latest proclamation," and this is the Emancipation Proclamation, "which is drafted in the same style, the Manifesto abolishing slavery, is the most important document in American history since the establishment of the Union, tantamount to tearing up the old Constitution." And so how are those quotes related, and how is that related to the slogan of Black Lives Matter? I think how these quotes are related is, first, thinking about this idea of the primary task being to fight the divisions within the working class, to bring to the working class together against the divisions within it, is, I think, extremely relevant today, even if Walter Rodney was not talking about my generation or the current generation that is leading the struggle, but his own generation. And his analysis of what race is and where those divisions come from, I think, give us an idea about how to get that done. And when he says that race and the appearance of race as being a real social fact, arising out of the conditions of production, arising out of the division, basically division within the labor market based on race, points toward the idea that struggle that can overcome those divisions within the labor market, overcome the divisions between employed and unemployed, but also the divisions between people who are employed as, say, full-time professors, like my friend Charlie Post here, and myself, who is an adjunct professor. But at every workplace, there are divisions like this, right? That these are the kinds of divisions that have to be broken down, and they have to be broken down in the context of struggle inside and outside the workplace. And so I think that is an extremely important point for us to think about, and one we can see happening in the streets right now. If you look at the images coming out of Minneapolis and coming out of most cities where there's massive demonstrations happening, it's not, even though this is a struggle that's led by Black people, or exactly because it's a struggle led by Black people, you don't look at the crowd and see that it is an all Black crowd. Many people who are Latina, who are white, who appear to be not Black, have joined the struggle and are not confused by the idea that this is a struggle for Black Lives Matter. They understand very well that the full content of the slogan, which is when Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Okay, so it's a universalist slogan in that sense. And I think we can see that people understand that very well through their actions, right? And that this is exactly a kind of moment of struggle where those divisions are being confronted in reality and being confronted by people in the streets, and being confronted, as Zach pointed out, I think, by people in workplaces connecting to this struggle in the streets as well. And we can hope to see that spread even more than it already has to the workplace struggle, in my opinion. So how does that connect to this point that Marx is trying to make, besides just the funny diss on Abraham Lincoln, which really appeals to my sense of, my sense of humor and, attacking chivalrous or something. Reality. Yeah. Well, so what he's saying there is, in a certain way, is that Lincoln is a cipher, that the fact that he's produced this dramatic proclamation ending slavery is not anything to do with his personal politics. It's nothing to do with his personal character, all the kinds of great man theories of history that have long been promoted as the explanation for the existence of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, Marx is right that it's not some beautiful, well-written document. And in fact, politically, it also was a cowardly document. It excluded the enslaved people who had not, included the states where that had people in slavery that had not seceded from the US. And so it was very much a kind of liberal, moderate attempt to resolve the contradiction that the war, in fact, had to resolve. And so what I think Marx is saying that's relevant to us is we should not be focusing on electing the right leaders or to putting the right people in the positions of bourgeois authority, but that they will become the mouthpiece of our movements. They will become the expression of our struggle as that struggle reaches a point where they are forced to. And so that's the sort of lesson that I took from that particular quote. And I think, what that means today is we're in a moment where I think a lot of people up until right now, or up until very recently, were sort of very upset and sad, had pitched all their hopes on this idea that if we don't elect Bernie Sanders president, there's no hope for socialism in the United States. There's no hope for socialist reform. And I think that's not true. I think we can win reform. We can win, in fact, socialism if things go really well through struggle in workplaces and in the streets, and not necessarily through, as Zach was saying, knocking on doors or this kind of attempt to, sort of put the right perfect people in power. And that's not to say, I for all my shit about this, I do vote occasionally, and I'm probably going to vote this time, and I'll probably vote for people that I think are better than the other people. But I don't think that that's socialism or socialist politics. I think class struggle is what socialism and socialist politics really are, and where it comes from. And so you know, I'm really excited to hear what the rest of my editors have to say. So I wanted to close with a third quote, and I'm sorry for adding on a third quote, but this is from the Marxist author and my favorite author, who is a Marxist who's not Marx, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, from the book The Wizard of the Crow, which, if you have not read it, is actually a book about mass uprisings in a time of illness and pandemic. It is about a corrupt authoritarian regime, a sort of fictional one, but one that has a lot of resonances with the regimes, particularly that Rodney was criticizing. And the book is just beautiful. This is a great time to read it. But the quote I picked out of it was from Nyawira, who's one of the main kind of characters in the book, who's expressing the class struggle, really. That's her role in the book. And she says, "The life of even the least among us should be sacred. And it will not do for any region or community to keep silent when the people of another region and community are being slaughtered. The wealth of science, technology, and arts should enrich people's lives, not enable their slaughter." And I think that's the ethos of Black Lives Matter in this moment. That's what it means to say Black Lives Matter. It means to say that everybody should matter, and everybody should control the resources of our society. And that is what I think the ethos of this movement is, and why I think that slogan still is with us, even as it kind of on its own sounds a little bit like the least possible thing to demand. In fact, it's a way of demanding everything. And I think that's what comes out. I think if you look at the history of where this slogan has already been and where I hope and think that it's going. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. And now, Vanessa, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. So I chose two quotes that come directly from the old man himself, Karl Marx. And the first is from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And this was written in the period spanning the very end of 1843 into the beginning of 1844. So Marx writes the following. He says, "The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. Theory is capable of gripping the masses as soon as it demonstrates ad hominem, and it demonstrates ad hominem as soon as it becomes radical. To be radical is to grasp the root of the matter, but for man, the root is man himself." This is actually one of my favorite passages from Marx. It shows up in my writings all the time because I think it's so important and relevant. And one of the things that I love about it is how he is expressing the relationship between ideal and material forces, right? And not thinking about them in some kind of completely abstract separation and fixity, right? But rather thinking about the way that these things interrelate and interpenetrate one another as categories and as real manifestations in the world and manifestations of struggle. And especially that bit that theory becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses, right? Ideas, of course, don't have a kind of independent existence out there in the ether. They're the ideas that are in people's minds. And we can think about what are the conditions that give rise to those ideas. And we can also think about, what is the impact of those ideas once people believe them, develop them, believe them, engage with them, and sometimes act on the basis of them. So there's just something that I love about the way that he kind of very elegantly and deftly brings these things together. And then also, of course, at the end of the passage, he says that to be radical is to grasp the root of the matter, but for man, the root is man himself. And I think this is, for me, one of the most important lessons of Marxism, right? This idea that, as Marx writes elsewhere, that man is the highest being for man, or we can say, human beings are the highest beings for human beings. There's nothing more important than us, right? We are the source of value. We are we are the way that we know about the world, right? Everything about how we interact with the world and know it and think about it and try to change it is, of course, completely mediated by us, by our collective social being and existence. And so, when he says, well, we have to grasp the root of the matter, and the root here is man himself, it means that in order that any kind of political inquiry, that inquiry into the nature of being, of the world, of existence, is always ultimately inquiry into the nature of human beings, right? Who are we? And importantly for Marx, we're essentially these beings that are constantly producing and reproducing ourselves through our own activity, which of course brings us full circle to this idea of well, what are the circumstances, what are the conditions under which we're doing that production and reproduction of ourselves and of our lives and of our social relationships. And that is, of course, often, always, right, on the basis of some kinds of ideas. And sometimes I think it's tempting to think, well, why do intellectual work? Why sit around and argue about theory? Why does it matter that we get right all of these kinds of, sort of fiddly, philosophical disputes about dialectical materialism, right? Or about what precisely is the relationship between race and class, for example. Why do we have to spend time writing at each other and arguing about these things? But the reason, I think, is something that Marx captures here really well, that the things we do in the world are impacted, are influenced, are conditioned by the ideas we have, and we want to get those ideas right. And it's not one of the passages I particularly chose for tonight, but thinking to Marx's theses on Feuerbach, where he writes that it is that the sort of older materialisms that Marx and Engels are responding to and seeking to replace, that they failed to really account properly for the role of ideas and for the interaction between ideas and matter. And Marx says, well, we can identify these elements in society that we think are going to change society, but then the question is, change it on the basis of what? How are they going to know what to do? They're going to have to do some theoretical engagement. And again, not in some kind of abstract separation from trying to change the world. For Marx, trying to change the world and trying to understand the world are the very same activity, right? They're praxis. So I just think this quote captures so much of that very beautifully. My second is from the German Ideology, 1846, and here Marx is writing together with Friedrich Engels, and he says, both for the production on a mass scale of communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew, right? And again, you have the idea of the self-making of humanity, right? That part of the process of revolution is for humanity to change itself, right? To make itself fitted to a new society. And this is a question that comes up again and again when I teach in the classroom about Marx, or when I talk with people about Marx ideas in general. People look around and they say, look at us, we're a mess. We human beings are a complete mess. What could possibly make you think that we could live together in a communist society? And the answer is nothing, right? I mean, as we currently exist and as we are formed by capitalism, the way that we interact with one another now as human beings, that's not going to fly, right, in a society that is supposed to be based on fellowship and mutuality, right? Part of the process is to transform ourselves, to directly intervene, right, into our nature, our character, our relationships, our practices of interacting with one another. And so when we say that revolution is necessary, right, one of the reasons why it's not just going to be a matter of kind of piecemeal reforms getting us along the way, right? One of the reasons why we do have to be involved in this kind of radical, practical activity of making it the case that people are able to control and to make decisions about their lives and about the things that they create, is that it's only in the process, the painstaking process of doing that we can produce ourselves, right? Self-make in such a way that we can unlock, unleash whatever kind of romantic language you'll tolerate from me, right? That we can kind of reveal or produce, right, ourselves as so that our essence is, so that our appearance, right, matches our essence, right, to get very, very Hegelian about things, so that we can truly become, right, what it is that we have the potential to be with one another. So yeah, that too obviously is one of my favorite quotes, or else I wouldn't have chosen it here to present to you. And yeah, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Vanessa. Before I call on Charlie Post, just a reminder to those who are listening that you can send in your questions. I will be trying to work through them. In some cases, I think they will be directed to specific editors of Spectre Journal. And in other cases, they may just be for any of us who want to dive in. But don't hesitate to do that. We will be making time for the questions that anybody wants to pose to us. With that, now over to Charlie Post.
Hi, I'm Charlie Post. I too live in Brooklyn. I teach at the City University. And the two quotes, I mean, I sort of struggled with this for several days after we made the decision that this is how we were going to format this. It ended up using two quotes I use as epigraphs on my email generally, because I think they both speak to the present moment. And the one is actually from a contemporary Marxist, in my opinion, the best Marxist political economist, Hall and Shaikh. And in his massive book, Capitalism, he has this beautiful phrase that capitalism's sheath mutates constantly, but its core remains the same. And for me, this talks very much to the epidemiological and political and economic moment we're in, because it allows us to understand two things that are very hard for, I think, most of the mainstream bourgeois economists, bourgeois sociologists and commentators, and also for a good portion of the left to understand, which is, on the one hand, the COVID-19 epidemic is in fact a product of capitalism, in particular, the hyper-specialization of capitalist agriculture, which has produced in the last 40, 50 years, new viral infections that have decimated large portions of the world's population. But it also allows us to understand that the current economic crisis is not the result of the pandemic. The pandemic is deepening it, it's giving it a specific form, but this crisis began the downturn, the contraction of the world economy, particularly the Chinese economy, started several months before the pandemic. And that this is ultimately rooted not in some set of accidents, some bank failing, some prime mortgages going under, the stock market in 1929 crashing, et cetera. These are all manifestations of a deeper and more regular process under capitalism, that the very things that drive this system forward, competition, accumulation, and profitability, constantly lead to periodic crises. Crises that are periods of tremendous destruction and suffering for masses of working class people all over the world, particularly those who are racialized and oppressed. But it is also a moment of possibility and clarity. It's one of those moments when the veil begins to be lifted and things become a little bit clearer. And it really, for me, it hammers home three key points: that the class struggle is ultimately irreconcilable. That's why we can't vote ourselves into socialism. That's why we can't piecemeal reform capitalism into something else. Capitalism as a system will constantly go into crisis. Capitalists will always go after whatever working people have ever gained in the past. Second, that capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with the reproduction of human life and capacities and the very physical environment that we depend on to survive as a species. And finally, it drives home to me that all the reforms that working people have won, all of them have been won through massive, disruptive, illegal, and as Zach pointed, sometimes unexpected mass struggles. But all of them are always under threat. They cannot be built one upon the other until we get to a better world. The logic of this system has to be broken. The second quote is from Gramsci. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And since 2008, the neoliberal capitalist order has been dying. Its capacity to maintain economic expansion and to legitimize the growing inequality and oppression that it's brought to the world's population is over. However, until the past few years, a truly new world, a socialist alternative based on the struggles of working and oppressed people, has been very late in arriving. 40 years of continuous defeats by movements of people, the movements of people of color, of women, of working people, the weakening over the last century of the radical layers of workers and activists all throughout the capitalist world, meant that when this crisis hit, the old died, the new could not be immediately born. And what we see is all sorts of monstrosities, in particular, the rise of xenophobic, nationalist, racist right-wing populism across the world. Trump, Bolsonaro, the Tea Party, and the revival, even in the great democracy, the US, of fascist gangs, the latest manifestations of that being these reopen the economy armed demonstrations by small business owners. However, the long-awaited arrival or birth of the new has begun to emerge. We saw the first hints of it well before Bernie Sanders decided to run for president in 2016, in Occupy, in the Wisconsin uprising, in the Chicago teacher strikes, and the first wave of Black Lives Matter struggles several years ago. And we have seen this in the revival of a new, small, mass, and very heterogeneous politically socialist movement, the red state teacher strikes, the wildcat strikes that have gone on the last few weeks in the face of 25 to 30% unemployment, which I think people need to reflect on. This is in some ways unprecedented, at least in the history of the last couple of 100 years. And today, possibly the emergence of movements of unemployed people against evictions, against impoverization, et cetera. And the new world is being born around us today in the urban uprisings led by African Americans, led by people of color, but as Kate pointed to, have brought in loads of young white folks, working class folks, and have won the sympathy of steadily employed workers, bus drivers, etc. That this is the new world that's being born, and one which we hope to play some role in giving some theoretical and intellectual weapons for in the coming struggles. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, that leaves me to round out the first go around among Spectre editors. And I'm happy to say that I am not going to duplicate any quotes. No one took either of the ones that I want to use. And also, I really spent some time thinking about two different passages that resonate with me in this particular political moment. The first one is from the German Marxist Walter Benjamin. It's from a document he wrote in the last year of his life. He was a political refugee from Nazism living in France at the time. He was on the cusp of exiting France because, of course, the Nazis were occupying France and Jews were being turned over to the Gestapo. All of this had Benjamin thinking quite profoundly about what a genuinely revolutionary approach to thinking about history is. And in a document that is today most generally known as On the Concept of History, but some of you may have heard of it as Theses on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin writes the following: "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency." And several things in that passage appeal to me. First, the idea that a truly revolutionary approach to history begins from its grounding in the traditions of the oppressed. It recognizes that the historical struggles of the oppressed produce a unique and potentially revolutionary kind of historical knowledge. That these struggles are the wellspring, these traditions are the wellsprings of any truly oppositional and revolutionary political activity. The second element is, of course, this insistence that it is disastrous politics to imagine that our task is to get rid of the emergency to go back to normal. And that in going back to normal, we return to conditions that are favorable to the struggle for socialism. On the contrary, Benjamin is saying to us that capitalism, class society, is a system of emergency experiences for the oppressed. And it is the capacity to organize within those. And that is the key. And of course, it's no surprise, therefore, that my comrade editors have referred to the wildcat strikes that have happened under the pandemic, the amazing urban uprisings focused on Black Lives Matter that are sweeping major cities in the US right now. These are struggles against the emergency in the midst of an emergency. But more than this, as I think all of us have been saying, they prefigure what Benjamin calls here the effort to bring about a real emergency. To bring about a real emergency means two things. First, an emergency for capital, a breakdown in the capacity of capital to economically reproduce itself and to societally and politically reproduce its social order. And then, of course, the other side of it is what Vanessa talked about, that emergency that allows the oppressed to radically transform themselves, to rid themselves of the muck of ages, to remake themselves with new solidarities and sensibilities, new collective identities as a revolutionary subject capable of transforming the world. In the same spirit, I've chosen for my second passage a quote from C.L.R. James, the great revolutionary Marxist born in Trinidad, spent most of his politically active years in England, then the US, and back in England when he was after he was deported from the United States. And in probably the last interview he gave, he died in May of 1989, and he gave this interview in April of 1989. I believe it's the last interview he gave. And he says something incredibly prescient for us today. James wrote, "You never know when it is going to explode. The revolutionary movement is a series of explosions when the regular routine of things reaches a pitch where it cannot go on." To me, that's a philosophical question based on history, and I am never in any doubt. I am in doubt for tomorrow, maybe, but I am never in any doubt for the day after tomorrow. It has been a fundamental part of my outlook, a statement of Marx early on, that the revolution comes like a thief in the night. That notion, which again, I think has run through the comments of a number of editors, that the only predictability that matters in the final analysis in the class struggle is that unpredicted explosions will create conditions for mass social insurgency. And when that happens, and we're seeing elements of that in urban centers across the United States right now, when those kinds of insurgencies happen, all of the coordinates of social and political life shift. All of the things that we think are regular politics are transformed. That's why you've heard a number of us suggest that politics for revolutionary socialists is about much more than electoralism and the ballot box. It's about much more than ordinary collective bargaining. We need to have a sense of theory that allows us to focus on the explosive possibilities of any historical moment. And one of the things that excites me about the Spectre project is that I think we understand this Jamesian insight that the revolution comes like a thief in the night, that we're always struggling to discern its movements. Marx, of course, famously used the metaphor of the old mole that burrows beneath the ground. That is to say that most of the time, we cannot see the revolutionary possibilities in our society. They sneak up on us like a thief in the night. Now, of course, we've also had some subversive thieving in the night recently. And I think that's in the spirit of this quote as well. It's in the spirit of the idea that revolutions turn the world upside down, and that this is the project to which we need to remain true. This is the only way of really maintaining a loyalty to the tradition of the oppressed. And for me, a large part of the excitement about being involved with the editors you've heard from tonight and the Spectre project is, I think, that revolutionary sensibility, that sense of commitment to the tradition of the oppressed is what animates the project as a whole. So on that note, I'm now going to turn over to some of the questions. And Holly, the first question began for you, but by the end, because Zach was speaking, our questioner also brought you into it a little bit, Zach, so feel free to follow up on Holly. It was in response to your analysis of your second quote, Holly. The question is, aren't the individual experiences also collective experiences, just non-identical? Isn't this the dialectic of sociality, particularity, and universality of social life? And then the questioner went on to say that they also thought that fit somewhat with what Zach was talking about towards the end of his comments. So Holly, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would say exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to say, the relationship between the universal and the particular here. I wasn't in any way trying to suggest that there was some kind of artificial gap, or that there was, I mean, exactly as the questioner put it, that what we're experiencing in our particular sense is the collective crisis at hand. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a dialectical relationship between the two. What was the second part of that question, David?
So the second part really is just an elaboration of this. Isn't this the dialectic of particularity and universality of social life?
It is. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is that I think that as much as we understand this in an intellectual sense, we still haven't found a way to put it into practice when we're engaging with one another, right? We understand it in this conceptual mode of that our individual experiences of crisis are related to the collective experience of crisis. But when we're organizing with one another, we still have a difficult time helping one another, right? Building one another, building up sections of the class on a one-on-one. I mean, if you think about all of the crises that different organizations, different publications have gone through, like we're still struggling with how to be there for one another, and we're still struggling with that kind of with that kind of interaction, and how to have how to collectivize the individual crises. How do we cope with the fact that sometimes these individual crises are in fact so not particular, but they're so collectivized that this kind of trauma, these trauma crises kind of broaden and start to affect all of us, and we start to all become overwhelmed. I mean, I think that these dynamics, at least on the Marxist left, have not been fully and carefully explored. I don't have any solutions. I just wanted to put it out there that in the time of COVID, this is going to become really important, this kind of analysis. I mean, it has been before, but I just wanted to put it out there, exactly what the questioner was asking, that dialectical relationship, and how we start to think through it, how we start to not, I mean, we can put on one another where we're so single-minded that we're driving ourselves. Yeah. And in some cases, and my past experience is certainly not with Spectre, which is wonderful. But we've driven ourselves and other people into the ground. And how do we do the opposite of that? How do we deal with the collective crisis and lift one another up as particulars at the same time, and gird and strengthen one another as individuals at the same time? So thanks for the question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Holly.
And then I'll just add to that. I think Holly gets it exactly right, that these particular struggles are universal struggles. And there's this problem I think we've seen on much of the left over the last 3 or 4 years, where there's a kind of severing of the universal from the particular. And to bring that back down to earth, what I mean by that is that when people say that, to take one example, if we have to have a demand like Medicare for all that immediately applies to every single person, what is that opposed to? To say things like, we shouldn't therefore push for to fight around police brutality, or if we think about struggle against sexual assault, or if we think about trans rights, or in any of these cases, these are class struggles. Mm-hmm. These are class struggles waged by sections of the working class. And so they become universal insofar as, sorry, there's weird feedback. I don't know if anybody else is getting it, but sorry, they become universal insofar as they are working class struggles. These particular struggles are people who are working class people fighting the conditions of their own everyday lives. And so the notion that every single struggle should immediately apply to everyone, I think, equally in some fashion, is beside the point. I mean, the other thing I'll quickly say is that that most of these so-called particular struggles turn out to be universal struggles, right? I mean, so if we take the example of police brutality, it might be the case that certain elements of the working class and the popular classes do face police brutality more than others. The fact is that the repressive apparatus of the capitalist state is organized against the working class in its entirety. And so insofar as it might be, might be aimed against certain sectors of that class more than others, it doesn't mean we don't unite as a class and fight back against it. So this notion that particular struggles divide the working class, I think, is actually quite backwards. That the particular struggles, empirically, it's where we see, I think, the most militancy, and we're seeing that right now. And B, it's precisely in fighting these particular battles that we begin to unite some kind of working class. And so this notion that we begin from unity, and this is what I mean by severing universalism or kind of universal claims. It's what I called trickle-down universalism, this idea that we just sort of like go straight for socialism and then every other antagonism gets immediately ameliorated, I think is absurd. And, I think it's actually exactly backwards, this notion that we make demands or actually wage struggles around our real lives, the concrete reality of our real lives, find what we have in common and build up from there. And so, this, I think, gets back to the question, and that this idea that particularity, I think, is inextricable from the universal, and that we never want to sever these two. We always have to think about how our concrete struggles are related to this broader fight, a universal fight.
Thank you, Zach. Charlie Post has indicated he'd like to have one kick at this question as well, and then I've got one for Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, coming from two sort of separate angles. One is to pick up on the point that both Holly and particularly Zach was making about all working class struggles start around particular issues, particular collective lived experiences and collective activities. Because the same people who are today saying, we don't want to talk about racist police killings, we don't want to talk about trans rights, we don't want to talk about abortion and reproductive health, we don't want to talk about any of these, quote, divisive, particularistic issues. We want to talk about the universal issues that are going to really change the world, are very quickly in a very short period of time, be the same people who will say to wildcat strikers, you're being particularistic, narrow, etc. You're diverting from the real struggle to elect the good person or have industry-wide collective bargaining, etc. Not understanding that, in fact, the only way that you get any sort of meaningful, etc., is particularistic struggle. But I just wanted to also add a slight, make it a little bit more complex about this question, because when I heard the question, I heard about individual versus collective experience. And I think both Holly and Zach were addressing the question of sectors of the class versus the class as a whole having certain experiences of struggle. But we should always remember that under capitalism, people's individual experiences of capitalism are often as competing sellers of their ability to work, which often lead them to believe that especially when the prospect of collective struggle isn't there, that the problem is other workers.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is Black folks, it's queers, it's immigrants, it's women, it's Jews, whatever. And it's collective experience and collective action, which is so crucial, as Vanessa was pointing out from that quote from the German ideology, that is so crucial to making the class fit to rule. Because it's through collective action and collective experience that we begin to understand that it's not just us as individuals who fucked up. It's not those people who are at fault. It's the boss, it's the state, and that we all have something in common.
Thanks, Charlie. So Vanessa, a question came in for you, which runs as follows. Vanessa, loved your quotes and points. When it comes to ideas and the way they shape us, how do you see the status of practices and techniques for subject formation? Are practices active or passive mechanisms?
I'm actually not completely sure I understand the question, but I'll just start talking.
Yeah.
And hopefully I'll speak to some of the main kind of themes of the question. So in general, if you ask me if something salient for change and transformation and navigating our way through crisis is going to depend on activity or passivity, I'll always choose the first one. So of course, right, we're talking about an active process, but actually, well, it's an interesting question, right? Because we got, for example, famously Marx at the beginning of the 18th Brumaire saying that men make history, but not in conditions of their own choosing, right? They do it in circumstances that are inherited from the past. And so importantly, I mean, there is a kind of interplay of our roles as agents and as patients of history, right? So we don't want to kind of embrace some kind of abstract voluntarism where we can just spontaneously choose whatever it is that we like, whether it is a tactic or a way to be, or, right, we can't. In fact, right, all we can do is intervene in and make use of and interact with the historical inheritance that we are given and the circumstances that we're given. So importantly, there is this kind of interplay between the ways that we are that we occupy a kind of role as encountering the world as it is, right, as it's given to us, but also realizing and producing our own agency and ability to intervene in that world. And this is one of the things that is so kind of subtle and important about Marx's philosophical perspective on the world, or Marx's conception about how change happens, is that it's through activity that we overcome what seems like that breach between our subjective existence and the objective world outside of it, right? So that we kind of knit those things together through practice. One of the things that's so important for Marx is that, and this is again something that he's himself, right, inheriting from Hegel and repurposing in his own way, right, is the idea that the kind of fundamental intellectual insight and practical achievement is to overcome what seems like that opposition between our subjectivity and the objective world, right? And to realize that human beings and the world they're in are one unified thing, right? It's the subject-object totality, and our ability to change ourselves is the same thing as our ability to change the world, and vice versa, right? It's always the same activity. So kind of thing, right? And the more that we do it effectively, the more that it becomes an active process, and the more fully we realize our agency. I just want to very quickly tack on to that, because I wanted to speak to the topic of the moment, of course, which is these uprisings that are blossoming and being set ablaze, sometimes quite literally, throughout the country. And of course, like in conversation, all of us have encountered all kinds of criticisms. Well, why do they do that? And don't they know this? And that's not the right way to do it. And I think, calling back to Zach said earlier, the working class is what it is at this moment. Working people did not ask for COVID-19. Working people did not ask for the police to come. They didn't ask for George Floyd to be killed now, but now is when it happened. And so now is when people have to respond with the tools they have, including the intellectual tools they have, the organizational tools they have, and so this is what's happening. And then the question is, okay, well, how in that process can that kind of spontaneous outrage that has burst out onto the scene, how can the folks that are making these uprisings engage in that practice of thinking about thinking together? What are we doing? What do we want? How are we going to do it? And transform themselves, hopefully, into a much more organized force, which, by the way, would also be a much more threatening force, which is a good thing, right? And so that question of that practical self-making, we're seeing it. If they remain spontaneous, if they remain unorganized, they won't be successful. I mean, that's true, right? And so there has to be that question of, okay, well, what are the next steps? But we don't get there by poo-pooing people, and saying, well, why don't they read their Marx, or like, that's ridiculous. People are making themselves into a fighting force right now, and our job is to aid and abet.
Terrific, thank you, Vanessa. I've got another question, Kate. I think I'm going to throw it to you and to me in that order, because it's just put to the editors generally. It's actually a two-part question. Does Spectre follow any kind of organizational tendency? Does Spectre have a politics? So why don't you start off on that, Kate, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, so does Spectre follow any kind of organizational tendency, and does Spectre have a politics? I'm going to start with the second one first and say Spectre definitely has a politics. And I think we've come together because we share a politics, and that politics is revolutionary, and it's a politics that unites really, I think, around the idea of a unitary theory of the working class, thinking about race, class, and gender through this idea of a unitary theory where race and gender and sexuality and all the kinds of intersections that we might think of are in fact constitutive of and constituted by class, and kind of the way that I was talking about with my Walter Rodney quote specifically about race. But I think that's the kind of uniting politics of Spectre, as well as I think a really commitment to being serious about Marxism and not kind of fudging or bullshitting around that question, that what we think that there's work to be done in terms of building out a Marxist politics for today. And that's the work that I think we are trying to engage in and facilitate and bring together. So that's what I would say about, do we have a politics? Do we come from a what was the way that was phrased, a tendency or something? An organizational
affiliation.
Yeah, so I mean, people have a range of organizational affiliations and no organizational affiliation, and a range of kind of histories of organizational affiliation, but Spectre doesn't have any organizational affiliation. So I do think, it's for people who think about this stuff, it's pretty apparent that, like Charlie and I used to be in a socialist organization together. I think some people used to be members of the International Socialist Organization. I'm currently a member of Red Bloom Communist Collective, which is part of the Marxist Center. So those all kind of exist in the mix, but I don't think that we certainly all aren't part of one organization, and Spectre is not a mouthpiece for any specific organization. There's several DSA members in this organization here. Probably that's the most predominant organizational affiliation, actually. So yeah, I mean, I think one other goal I would just say is that however you might classify the political background of Spectre editors in general, if one were to do so, our goal is to exceed that in terms of what the debate and range of discussion and analysis in Spectre is. So, I really hope people aren't trying to kind of pigeonhole us into some kind of train spotting, pigeonhole. Anyway, that's my answer to that.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. I loved actually the way Kate started with Spectre as having revolutionary commitments and striving to develop a unitary theory of the way in which capitalism organizes itself through multiple structures and relations of oppression. And I think that is very much a shared commitment. You can also, I think, get a sense just from all the presentations that the editors gave of the ways in which we see the Marxist project as one that's in development, as inherently dynamic, as not the repetition of a set of historic positions that simply have to be defended, but actually as a living, breathing, engaged political and theoretical tradition that is struggling to make sense of the world in which we live, both, as I said earlier, its crises and its revolutionary possibilities. And so we heard passages from Marx, from Rosa Luxemburg, from Antonio Gramsci, from Walter Rodney, from C.L.R. James, to give a sense as well that the revolutionary tradition is sufficiently expansive and open that it's in constant development. To me, that idea of the traditions of the oppressed that Walter Benjamin used is really crucial there, because of course the oppressed are struggling right now. They are creating new traditions of struggle and organization before us, like thieves in the night right now. And so that idea as well, that the revolutionary tradition is always open-ended and ongoing, that there's a sense in which we are trying to delineate the deepest, most profound, most subversive aspects of the struggles that are happening around us. So I'm also seeing in the chat here that Spectre editors are really interested in pressing one another on various points. And Kate, it seems to me that you want to raise a point about the repressive apparatuses of the state and the relationship to workplaces and workplace struggles. I think initially in relationship to Zach's comments, but it may have taken on some wider currency. So why don't you start there and we'll see where we go.
Okay, I just have two quick kind of comments for both for Zach and then for Holly about your presentations. And just to say, my comments aren't because I'm picking on you, it's because I was so interested in what you have to say, of course. So Zach, one of my questions was this idea about the repressive apparatus. It seemed to me you were sort of in your, and I know you only had 10 minutes, but in this comment, kind of presenting the repressive apparatus as something that people confront outside of work, contra to the workplace. And I think that's maybe I don't think you really think that. I think that, you know, the repressive apparatus happens at work, and a lot of the technologies of repression are really highly developed at work. And sort of interestingly, I don't know if this is true or not, but I read in a couple of different articles that actually George Floyd and the police officer that murdered him, Chauvin, worked together as, interestingly enough, security guards at a nightclub. And so this idea of kind of divide in the context of work and work as being part of the repressive apparatus, and also the repressive apparatus kind of taking place at work, I think is all very kind of like suggested in that little set of facts. And I just wanted you to comment quickly on that. And my other point was for Holly, which was I was really interested in, I think tradition started with you, Holly, but it came up in pretty much almost everybody else's talks. And so I really liked your coming out hard as like a queer Marxist against this, you know, against tradition, including traditions of the left that can be wrong, right? And that can be limiting. So I really was feeling that very strongly, but I'm interested in how does that interact for you and for other people with this idea, right, of kind of moments of crisis and struggle coming back with a lot of the same content that they previously had, because we didn't win, you know, in 1968. We didn't win in the last 6 iterations of uprising. And, you know, stuff like I walked around today in Brooklyn and I was listening to a bunch of boomers, you know, Caribbean American and African American, you know, boomers playing Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke and Marcus, you know, you know, struggle music from the last big period of struggle. And for me, it was very moving. And to hear those lyrics in this context gave them this whole new valence, this whole new like meaning, and a meaning that was like shockingly appropriate to today. And so, you know, I think you mentioned it, but I just want to draw out that kind of the contradiction maybe between this, what is tradition and what is just unfinished business, I guess. So yeah, those were my two questions for my co-editors.
Okay, so let's start with you, Zach.
Sure, and I'll try to be real brief here. Yeah, I'll say that I wear 2 hats. I'm a sociologist, which means I can sometimes be clear, and I'm a relational thinker, which means I can sometimes be right. And I think here I've erred on the side of sociology in terms of separating these 2 things that I think you've rightly pointed out shouldn't be separated: the workplace and the repressive apparatus. You know, thinking to classic examples of police and National Guard, if not the military, cracking down on general strikes, to, even if we think of Eric Garner as selling Lucy's as a form of informal labor, and their police are cracking down. So yeah, I mean, this idea that these should be separated, I think, is a false separation. I will say that I do think there's something about the repressive apparatus in the workplace and outside of it that does tend to catalyze mass struggles in a way that sort of pure, let's say, the dull compulsion of the market does not. And this is why I think even, say, struggles against police, while they might not immediately achieve any aim, I think what they do tend to do is catalyze struggles that then gain a certain momentum of their own. And so, on the one hand, absolutely right, the repressive apparatus is not separate from the workplace, but on the other hand, there is something unique, I think, about struggles around repression. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, and Holly on tradition.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Kate. So, Kate and I, listeners probably wouldn't know, but Kate and I both spent a lot of time in Durban, South Africa. And I want to actually take this to the experience of being a communist in Durban is very different in a lot of ways concerning tradition than it is in the US. So I was asked to speak at kind of a left faction of the Young Communist League there. And there was 20 minutes of singing traditional communist songs at the beginning of the meeting, which went from, I think, 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when I left anyway, but there was 20 minutes that were spent. And so let's think about that in context of how that happens, right? Is this something that when people are doing it together, is it reminding them of their unities? Is it something that's experientially important? For me, it was totally novel and had no tradition whatsoever. I was just really getting into it and learning. So it was very vibrant for me. It was something that was new. But now let's imagine that same scenario when you're in the middle of an uprising and it's like, come now, comrades, this is what we do. We do our singing, right? And I think that, organizations I've been involved with and, habits that I've had in the past were, this is what we do. When something happens, this is how we respond. And it almost became routinized. And then that routinization, because it sometimes can get results in a predictable way, right? Becomes, well, this is how we do things. This is our tradition, and this is what, and then it becomes some kind of argument. And I think that that's incredibly deadening. And so, I'm not a Sartrean, but this idea of the practico inert, right? The idea that something starts out vibrant and then it dies and it becomes this decaying dead matter. I think that we need to pay attention to that. Where is there like a dissipation? But that doesn't mean that, so in other words, we can take something that's very traditional and it can be enlivening in the moment, in context, in the concrete world, right? Or it can be entirely deadening, right? Just in the same way that kind of routinely bringing up the need to make everything novel is also deadening, right? It's also what we see in Capital. Capital, in fact, has taken that from us, that ability to be novel. So instead of, our being able to be novel and think things through creatively, you start talking about novelness maybe with students or something, and people start thinking about like new tech innovations, like putting it like, oh, there's this new product that like straps like an alarm clock to your sneaker or something like that. Instead of these kind of like really kind of world transforming kinds of senses of the meaning of new. So my point is to take these terms and to think about it in the concrete way. And that's what I found Marx doing in the 18th Brumaire, and why I thought that it was resonant on so many different registers. So.
And I see, Charlie, you had wanted to come in on, I think maybe the first.
Well, actually the first and also I think Holly's things as well. I mean, I don't particularly like the whole language of the repressive apparatus in the workplace. It's reminds me of a very bad period in my life when I read a lot of Althusser, and which I've tried to get beyond at this point. But I think that one of the points is that's very important, I think Kate and Zach were getting at, is not just that it's that even at the workplace, the most explosive workplace struggles historically have not been around wages, hours, benefits. Some defensive struggles we've seen in the last 20 years, defense of certain benefits like pensions, but have always been around, the most massive strikes have been around opposition to the despotism of capital at the workplace, which, despite what some sociologists may claim, is a constant and real feature of life under capitalism. So if you look at the US in the 1930s, real wages were rising, but workers were rebelling against speed up, de-skilling, the abuse by foremen, etc. These issues of how political control, supervision, management manifests itself, I think are going to have always been and will again be. I think the key to class struggle. I mean, Holly, I think what you were saying, the two things I think really resonated with me, because what you're talking about on the one hand are traditions that come out of a lively, actual collective movement that's every day confronting the bosses, confronting the state, confronting landlords, etc. And you develop songs, ways of sociability, etc. And that as these movements die down, as their leaders basically put the maintenance of institutions that give them a very profoundly privileged lifestyle over the needs of struggle, these things become routinized. So in German social democracy, the singing of Red May Day demonstrations became completely routinized. The communist parties in Europe would have these demonstrations where they talk about socialism once a year and then go back to routine collective bargaining. I think the other two things we have to sort of also warn against is attempts to revive traditions of past struggles that don't exist anymore and try to recreate them, in ways that just don't have a material existence anymore in people's lived practice. And on the question of novelty, being open to things being new, but also not being taken in by every new intellectual fashion, impressionistic ideas, etc. Because just as much as there's a problem, I think, on the left with dogmatic repetition of either social democratic, pseudo-Leninist political practices, etc., routines and nostrums, there's also this tendency to say everything's changed, it's completely different, and work on basically impressionistic analysis, which I think is something that both of these things are what I think at Spectre we need to be sort of pushing against.
Thanks, Charlie. So I'm seeing several questions come in here, and I'm going to sort of try to group them. I see we're down to our last 15 minutes or so. So I think I'll kind of group them this way. One of them is about the question of family abolition, which has come up a few times at Red May this year. Yesterday, there was a family abolition event. And the questioner says, Kate, you have done some great thinking on family abolition. Does family abolition have any relevance to Spectre's project? If so, how? And Kate, that might be an opportunity to say a little bit about the spirit in which Sophia Lewis has discussed.
So I'll just answer that really quick.
Sure.
And say that I think, that's why there's a review of Sophia Lewis' book in the very first issue of Spectre. And my hope, certainly for Spectre, is that we can be a place that really does the most kind of advanced, thinking about Marxist feminism and debates among Marxist feminists from a variety of traditions. And that's, partly what that's all doing in there. And the second thing is I'm planning, actually hoping to interview Michelle O'Brien, who's just written a long piece about family abolition for EndNotes for the Spectre online webzine, because I know she comments on my work, and I think also on Jules' work, who may or may not be the person who asked that question. So yeah, I think family abolition is something that we're definitely going to discuss and have already discussed. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Kate. There are several questions related to capitalism and racism. One of the questioners here actually notices that Charlie Post and I hold different positions on the relationship between slavery and capitalism, but I don't think we'll go there tonight, Charlie.
No, that's not terrible. It's like debates on the Soviet Union. It's really not immediately relevant.
Shocking, we're allowed to have different positions. Amazing.
Exactly.
Even the various editors of Spectre have different positions on this question.
Right.
Sometimes I have different positions on the same question.
Precisely. But running through several of these questions is this issue that's just posed in one formulation. What is the relationship between capitalism and racism? Kate, you used the term unitary theory earlier. I know, Vanessa, you've been doing a lot of thinking and writing on this. So why don't we ask Vanessa to come in on that one? And then there's a follow-up on the question of the state, which I'll get to.
Sure. So as I understand it, the question is, what is the relationship between race and class? So I'll try to answer it in brief.
Can I just intervene for 1 second? Just having read the question, and Vanessa, I think this will be more interesting if you answer this aspect of the question, which is, it's specifically asked, can racism operate independently of capital? And what do we think about that? That's one of the specific questions. So rather than kind of like abstractly, how does racism and capitalism relate? I think that question is sort of interesting. And I am actually very curious about how you or others would answer that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. So can racism function independently of capital? Yes and no. So Engels talks about the relationship. Obviously, it talks a lot about the relationship between material circumstances and theory. And one of the things that I think Engels does a nice job of illuminating is that when we think about the idea, for example, that ideas are in some sense determined by material circumstances, we're not talking about ideas as a kind of epiphenomenon or byproducts, right? That things that are happening on the material economic class level, just in some very simple kind of mechanical way, make it the case that people have the ideas they do. There's all kinds of stuff that happens at the ideal level or in the ideal aspect of being that we're not going to sort of trace back in some direct mechanical way to some specific minute thing that's happening at the concrete level. At some point, we're going to want to think about the relationships and exchanges between ideas, but at the same time, right, the kinds of ideas that people have, the way those ideas transform and metamorphize and get expressed and get exchanged, when we think about in a more global sense of, how is it that these conversations take on the character that they do, that racist ideology takes on the character that it does, we're going to want to ask questions about how is it that human beings produce anything about their lives. And in a capitalist society, the way that we produce our lives, by and large, the most important relationship is the relationship between people that produce commodities for sale and receive a wage as a result and live on the basis of their ability to sell their labor power, and the relationship between them and the relationship own the means of production, right? Who own the factories, who own the raw materials, et cetera. And so it means that we want to think about that because that's how everything is being produced, including our ideas in the final analysis, right? And then there's another way of thinking about the question. And I've been thinking about this recently. I've recently been writing about this because sometimes, people they don't even have to be critics of Marxism. They can just be, curious people who are trying to figure it out. Ask, well, are you saying that if we overthrow capitalism, racism is just going to go out the window? Well, wouldn't that be nice? But of course, but I don't say that. I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that there's a basis for that in Marx. When Marx talks in in his critique of the Gotha program, for example, and there he's talking about ideals of bourgeois rights, right, of the idea of moral or rights in bourgeois society. He says that after the success of a proletarian revolution, you are still going to have those same ideas. And people are still going to have to transform them and do all kinds of political and intellectual work to develop new and better ideas and get rid, and kind of do away with the intellectual detritus, right, of the old society. And I don't see any reason to think that racism would be different. What would be different is that we would have the masses of people actually having access to the things that are necessary in order to create that kind of massive theoretical, intellectual, attitudinal, right, transformation, which is a major project and which is absolutely doomed under capitalism.
Lovely. Thanks, Vanessa. So I've got a kind of a two-part question here, and it may in fact be expansive enough, the second part, that a few of us will want to come in on it, and maybe it's a theme that we'll finish up on. The first part is specifically for me. It points out that in my book, Against the Market, I make a, quote, hard argument for planning. What do I have in mind there? And then there's a follow-up question, what role does the state have to play in socialism? So I'm going to start off on that and then let anybody who wants to come in on this question of the state to do so. But I'll start really by saying that while we do not have a position on this as Spectre editors, I think it's probably true to say that we all sort of share an ethos of very deep suspicion of what I'll call the statist temptation. That is to say, the idea that we default to the idea of the use of the state as the instrument and the modality for transforming society. And here I think that suspicion of the statist temptation is really in the spirit of probably the most important warning that Rosa Luxemburg made to the Bolsheviks in her pamphlet on the Russian Revolution, where she essentially said, listen, comrades, you've done something amazing and brilliant in actually overthrowing Tsarism and withdrawing from the imperialist war and so on, but you suffer from a temptation to rely on the party comrades to make decisions together through the instrument of the new state, rather than being sufficiently radically committed to mass democracy as the means of socialist transformation. And so when I, for instance, in Against the Market, make a strong argument against the market, I also make one against the state, where I argue that we're talking about two different modes of alienated social life with the market and the state. And so that we want to actually get back to that insistence that mass democracy is a form of public authority that is not a state in any conventional sense of the word. That is to say that there are institutional forms for the self-organization of working class and socialist power that, as Engels put it about the Paris Commune, that it's a state which is no longer really a state. It's moving away from being a state. It's dissolving itself as a state into new kinds of public authority based on mass democracy. So I'll start the discussion there, but I know it's got a lot of contemporary resonances around parliamentary politics and electoralism and the history of Stalinism and so on. So any other editors want to come in on this question? I see Charlie Post.
Yeah, I mean, I think David summed up a common sensibility amongst all of us. And I think that for the existing capitalist state, it means that I think for most of us, the idea that we can somehow use pieces of the state to affect reform, affect piecemeal transition, affect a transition, even a radical break with capitalism, is illusory. That these are institutions that are, as David put it, alienated forms of social relations that are incompatible with socialism as the self-rule of working people. And on the other side, to see that the state, a true worker state, workers' democracy, is a state in dissolution. Now, this process may take time. It will undergo this process unevenly. The Bolsheviks made plenty of political errors. They were also in one of the more backward and more isolated societies in Europe. And that the complete dissolution of the state is probably not possible until capitalism has been uprooted in a particularly large part of the world, so that people are free to engage in the work of building a non-alienated public authority. But the idea that either the existing state or some sort of post-capitalist state that can act independently of the will and volition and needs of working people is somehow a solution. These are the two dead ends of socialism, historically of socialism from below, of social democracy, and what the tradition many of us come out of have called Stalinism, state collectivism, whatever.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Both Kate and Zach have indicated that they want to have a quick kick at the can on this point, and then I think I'll just see if there's any last comments before we do a little quick wrap up. So Kate and then Zach.
Yeah, just real quick, I just want to say, for me, in response to that question, why should we assume that planning is a function of the state? And I think we shouldn't assume that, especially when we see in practice, in moments like we're in right now, that planning by workers is already happening on the ground. And that is actually the dynamic by which revolution or any kind of real collective effort by the working class will take place. Planning will happen in the process of building a class for itself. For example, just workers deciding what kind of work is actually essential in a pandemic, what kind of products have to go where. That is happening right now. So the idea that planning is something that only the state can do, or that the state is best at, is, I think, totally wrong and contrary to how I view Marxism and communism.
Thank
and
you.
I think
Zach.
I think this question of the state is also something that tends to unite most Spectre editors. I mean, insofar as, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but that earlier question, I think we're all to varying degrees skeptical of a recent social democratic turn, and in my own case, I think it's largely a strategic question. When we think about the ferocity with which the bourgeois media came down on Bernie Sanders running on a marginally social democratic program, probably to the right of Jesse Jackson, you can imagine what would happen if an actual socialist were to try to go the parliamentary route. If we think of capital strikes, let alone capital flight, let alone the use of the military. I mean, and I don't mean to get into LARPing territory here, but the fact is that what's often, I think, represented as the pragmatic route isn't pragmatic at all. And I really, really want to emphasize this, that strategically, I think the use of the existing state is a problem. I mean, and when we ask, would we use the state to get to socialism? The short answer is, well, what do you mean by the state? And what do you mean by socialism? So I'll leave it there.
Okay. Holly, Vanessa, any quick final words?
Sorry, couldn't unmute myself, of course. Yeah, when it comes to the state, I actually want to add something. I completely am in accordance with the other editors on this point. There's another issue, and that's kind of from the left side of this question that I think is I mean, I guess you could anyway. It is through the mass planning that we're not going to give up mass planning. And the other danger, I think, is this kind of fantasy of communalism. We live in a global society. We live in a global political economy, right? And we have to coordinate with workers around the world, and we need some kind of mechanisms to speak with one another and to interact with one another. And I think that that's a really important part of whatever future that we have. So I think that, and I absolutely don't think that that's a state, but I think that we need to think in terms of what is it that we're going to need in order to organize, in order to plan and communicate and to build, what we now would call international worker state, and not something that is like somehow ridiculously local. So that would be the only thing that I add to that. One of the things that I wanted to just say in terms of the reason why I brought up my second quote actually wasn't entirely because I wanted to deal with the idea of the universal and the particular, but was I picked a quote from Marx talking about his personal problems. And because I wanted to point out to anybody who is a Marxist out there that Marx himself was going through crises and struggle and was not immune from the problems that come out of capitalist society and suffered from those problems. So if you are also through this period suffering from what we're all going through, or even before this period and after this period, that, the best of us have gone through have gone through that exact same thing. And because we're all experiencing that. So I guess it was just also a way to point that sometimes through our readings we can break out of our isolation and see how our collective situation can be a part of our experiences of oppressions, and how that can actually be something that we can use in order to communicate and build deeper resonances with one another. So it was actually something kind of really that small and non-philosophical, if you will, non-social, social ontological. Thanks, that's all.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, any parting comments?
Yeah, so I co-sign everything that my co-editors have said in response to this question. And I'll also add two related things. So one is that when Marxists talk about abolishing the division of labor, we're talking about the workplace, but not just the workplace, right? And one of the things that we're talking about is the way that political decision-making gets professionalized and kind of siloed into these particular halls of power, and the masses of people don't participate in it at all, or they participate in this extremely attenuated manner once every 4 years, right, in the ballot booth. And one of the things that is our aim is to abolish that division, right? Is to make it the case that you do not have a state apparatus that is sitting atop of society, separate and isolated from it and not accountable to it, but rather to reabsorb those functions into the life of everyone together, right? To make it a part of society's activity, something that everybody is doing, everybody is engaged in, right? Is to abolish that division of political labor. And again, right, to bring it back to what we're seeing now, right, is, one of the things that happens when you have these kinds of mass movements and mass protests, it is the people in saying they're not going to take it anymore, right? And just insisting that they are going to take back their political agency and exercise it. And so it's a kind of inkling, right, of glimmer, right, of what it looks like to do away with this artificial separation between the state and the people that are ruled by it. And the last thing I want to say, I don't want to go on at great length, but I've done some work about Marx's views on religion and atheism. And one of the things that is so striking is that Marx writes these comments where he says that the kind of liberal bourgeois faith in the liberal state is a kind of religion. It's a kind of religiosity, right? That we say that we are free, but what we really mean is this kind of like abstract imagined figure of the citizen is free. Meanwhile, the actual in bondage and subjection, right? We don't want that, right? And so that's one of the reasons why, as my co-editors have beautifully stated, when we talk about the role of the state, we mean something utterly unrecognizable in comparison to the kinds of things that people often have in mind when they talk about how a state functions and how it relates to the people who live within it.
Oh, what a beautiful note for us to be wrapping up on. Thank you, Vanessa. Let me begin by again thanking Red May, Philip, who did the lovely and generous introduction to our session, Sean, who's been navigating all the chat and firing the questions over to me. Those of you who've been listening to us will have picked up that we really learn from listening to one another. I find it terrifically stimulating to hear my co-editors tackle some of these questions and begin to think out loud together. That's got to be an indispensable part of what any serious revolutionary socialist project is right now, developing laboratories for collective self-discovery, analysis, mapping of the realities around us and the like. And I think that's at the heart of the Spectre project. It's part of the commitment that we're making to our subscribers and supporters as well, that we're not going to be lazy and hackneyed. We're not just going to fire off some quick line type publication for you. We're going to tackle questions. We're going to grapple with them. We're going to disagree among ourselves sometimes because this is the process that all of us need collectively as we try to rebuild a revolutionary socialist left that actually speaks to the challenges of this particular political moment. So thank you to Red May. Thank you, Spectre editors, and thank you all of our supporters and subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, you know what you got to do. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, David, for moderating for us on the fly. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And
Great.
a great pitch for a basic materialism at the end. If you don't subscribe, this journal will not continue to come out.
And there's only a few first issues left, so get on it right now. Bye.
Journal.com, Spectre, the British spelling.
Well, thank you very
everyone.
much, Spectre editors,
Good night.
for doing this. You solved a problem for Red May. Every year we have something called the Marxathon, which was modeled on the sort of Bloomsday and Ulysses, where you would take capital and move from bar to cafe and comment on a passage, or it could be Mario Tronti or something like that. And we just thought there's no way we can do it this year. You have to do it going from place to place. And you guys came up with a way to actually combine like 8 Marxathons in one, in the kind of same spirit of being a lab that's sort of investigating what the system is that we live in and what are the aspects of it that we don't know about, and working days and so forth. So I salute you for allowing us to say we really did a Marxathon this year. We haven't skipped it, and next year we'll have a live one again, and bring some of you out to continue. It's great. It's our Tiger's Leap into the past.
Wonderful.
So, thank you very much, Charlie and Vanessa and David and Kate and Holly and Zachary and Vanessa's double, because there are 2 Vanessas on the
Actually, 3 Vanessas.
which goes with German philosophy that I know Vanessa does. And
Right, that's right.
David was talking about money, and for some reason I was so enthusiastic about Spectre that I forgot to pitch for money for Red May before the event. And I better do it now before you all leave or hang up. We have, if we get $300 more, we've reached $4,000, which is a third of the way on our goal to next year, which is pretty good in a month. So all you got to do is go to www.redmayseattle.org, click on donate, give us your small dollar donations, or go to our YouTube, Red May TV, look in the descriptions, there's a place to click there, and also subscribe to Red May TV. We're very, very close to getting enough subscribers to get free real-time CC captions so we can make Red May available to the differently abled. So I'll say good night and tell you that tomorrow at noon, We're having Border Panic and Contagion with Dan Denver of The Dig. He has a new book called All American Nativism from Verso. Harsha Walla has a book on border imperialism. So once again, thanks to all the Spectres, and good night.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks.
Good night. Thank you for having
night.
us.
Thanks
I
for
think
having us.
we're off.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, it was great. It was really
Thank you. Really
Um,
appreciate it. Be
yeah,
well.
and
Bye.
you guys too. And we'll be in touch. We want to keep doing a Zoom component to Red May. Maybe next year we'll be live on weekends, but have weekdays. So, if people